Hello, I'm Mark Christ. I'm head of adult programming for the Central Arkansas Library System, and I'm also a Civil War historian. I've written and edited several books on the Civil War in Arkansas, and today we're going to be talking about the July 4, 1863 Battle of Helena. So Helena on the Mississippi River at the foot of Crowley's Ridge has been under control of Union forces since July 12 of 1862, when General Samuel Curtis's Army of the Southwest, having marched from Pea Ridge in northwest Arkansas into central Arkansas and then across the eastern part of the state to Helena, ending the Pea Ridge campaign that started in February of 1862. Curtis took possession of Helena, and it became a key base for the Union troops who were operating against Vicksburg. And the origin of the Battle of Helena is that Confederate forces in Arkansas attacked Helena to try to relieve pressure on Vicksburg, which had been under siege for several months at that point. So the Union forces at Helena are under the command of this man, Benjamin Mayberry Prentice. Prentice is best known for having commanded the troops at the Hornet's Nest at Shiloh, and that gave him a respect for fortified positions. So when he came to took command at Helena, he ordered several redoubts made on hilltops surrounding the town, and they're fashioned in such a way as they can swivel their cannon to support each other if they come under attack. These batteries are going to be labeled batteries A, B, C, and D from north to south, and they command all of the roads leading into Helena. Inside the town of Helena is Fort Curtis, which is a large fortification with siege quality guns. The troops manning Fort Curtis and all four of the batteries are manned by soldiers from the 33rd Missouri Infantry Regiment who have been cross-trained as artillerymen. And they were actually quite good at it. One admiring rebel after the July 4 battle wrote that the way they handled the pieces made us wish we had met another kind. So the approaches to Helena are also cut through with steep ravines and dominating bluffs. And Helena's impressive defenses are manned by just over 4,000 men from Iowa, Indiana, Missouri, Wisconsin, and Kansas, as well as the recently recruited 2nd Arkansas Infantry of African descent. So Prentice is expecting trouble. The rural Phillip Countyans have been coming into town seeking refuge. Secessionists within the town have been acting strange, and there's been increasing rebel pressure on his picket lines. So as a precaution, he had began ordering the entire Yankee garrison on alert and under arms by 2:30 each morning, beginning a week before Independence Day. They also cut down trees, blocking all the roads into Helena, and Prentice will also cancel plans to celebrate the 4th of July, though with the way things turned out, there were indeed ample fireworks in Helena on Independence Day. So approaching Helena are some 7,646 rebel troops under the command of Lieutenant General Theophilus Holmes, who we see here. He's disparagingly and not altogether inaccurately nicknamed Granny by his men. Holmes had dithered for days before deciding to attack Helena, and his troops were exhausted after marching across eastern Arkansas from Little Rock and Jacksonport through heavily flooded areas. Some of them were in water up to waist deep as they approached. Young Arkansan David Moore wrote of that march, "It is useless to tell you anything of the hardships of our marches through the Mississippi swamps. No one but an actual participant can picture anything like the reality. It was mud and water all the time, from knee deep up to the armpits. It would not be surprising if the number of sick from exposure on this trip will equal that of the killed and wounded in the fight. So, historian Robert Kirby calls Holmes's plan of attack, quote, a model of brutal irresponsibility. And that is a fair assessment given the results of the attack. The Confederate general's plan calls on the attacking forces to approach Helena in the dark of night, then do a coordinated three-pronged assault on the Union left, right, and center at daylight. The plan calls for Brigadier General John Sappington Marmaduke to attack Battery A from the north, supported on his left by Marsh Walker's Confederate horsemen. James Fagan will be attacking Battery D from the south, while Sterling Price, with his large division consisting of Mosby Parsons Missourians and Dandridge McCrae's Arkansans, will attack Battery C in the center. This converging attack, which would be difficult under the best of conditions, is further hindered by poor scouting and Holmes's unclear directions. The order to attack at daylight, in particular, will have tragic repercussions for the attacking rebels. A combat team led by Colonel William Brooks will be the first to draw blood, skirmishing with Union pickets on the lower Little Rock Road below Battery D. And Brooks does bring up some artillery. Some of the little action by Confederate artillery we'll see this day. But after he fires a few shots, the USS gunboat Tyler on the Mississippi River will chase him away with a couple of shots from her oversized bow gun. Fagan's Arkansas division, meanwhile, is the first to approach its objective, clawing through the thick obstacles on the upper Little Rock Road. At 4:05 a.m., forward elements of Hawthorne's Arkansas infantry will spot the Federal works manned by troops of the 43rd Indiana Regiment. Fagan orders a charge, and his Arkansas troops drive the Hoosiers from their first line of rifle pits, merely to fall back to a second, where they're joined by soldiers of the 33rd Iowa and 35th Missouri from General Frederick Salomon's Strategic Reserve. Fagan troops are winded by their initial rush and end up trapped in a deadly crossfire from artillery pieces in Batteries D and Battery C. And despite the raking fire of the Yankee cannoneers and the hail of mini balls from the Union troops before them, Fagan and his men grimly plowed forward, driving the Northerners from 3 more lines of rifle pits before halting, exhausted, below the looming fortification of Battery D. And here we see Battery D as it exists today. Captain Dennis Ban of the 37th Arkansas described the assault on Battery D thus. He wrote, "The ground at this point was almost impassable, an old road and a deep ravine full of timber, which scattered our men, and it was impossible to keep in line. But we succeeded in getting through after remaining in the timber and hollows nearly 2 hours under a heavy fire and made a charge. When the enemy giving way, we entered the rifle pits. Here many of our men fell, perfectly exhausted from overheat." At about the same time, Fagan began his assault on Battery D, John Sappington Marmaduke commenced his attack on Battery A from the north. His dismounted troopers had spent much of the night floundering through the woods on darkened trails that they used to avoid the timber-choked roads. At first light, they attempted to charge, but are swiftly repulsed by the Yankee cannon atop Ryder Hill and the well-aimed volleys of the 29th Iowa Infantry Regiment. Marmaduke will bring some cannon to bear and will almost lose him. His cannon and Brooks's are the only Confederate artillery that will see action on this day. So to the left of Marmaduke, his troops are stymied. They're slowed by Prentice's well-placed barricade, and they're opposed by Colonel Powell. Pardon me, Colonel Powell Clayton's 5th Kansas Cavalry and 1st Indiana Cavalry, and Walker doesn't really make much of a attempt to fulfill his duty to cover Marmaduke's left, and that ends up pretty much dooming the assault on Battery A. General Joe Shelby was among the men who fought with Marmaduke on that day, and he was badly wounded in this battle. One of his men wrote that Shelby, braving death as if holding a charmed life, and having 2 horses previously killed under him, at last received a dreadful wound that shattered his wrist, plowed through his arm, and caused intolerable agony. So both Fagin and Marmaduke must have had one thought at the front of their minds at this point: where was Price? For hours, there'd been the thunder of battle from the north and the south, while Price has not started his assault on Battery D. And here's born the grim fruit of Theophilus Holmes' vague order to attack at daylight. Price interprets daylight to mean sunrise as opposed to first light, and incredibly halted his attack on the on Battery C while waiting for sunrise to arrive, despite hearing the roar of battle from his right and his left. And Price's failure to press the attack almost certainly doomed any chance the Confederates had of victory on this 4th of July. Now, Price had abandoned his artillery because the roads were blocked by the fallen timber that Prentice had put down there. But he brought along his best cannoneers so that if and when they took Battery C, they would be able to man the Union cannon and turn them around and use them against the forces within Helena. So preceded by the 9th Missouri Sharpshooter Battalion with Parsons Missourians on the right and McRae's infantry on the left, Price finally moved forward. The rugged terrain did separate the 2 brigades as they neared Battery C, causing further delay as Price's staff officers worked to reestablish contact between the 2 wings of his force. And finally, they charged forward. As with Fagin's troops, Price's men fell victim to the interlocking fields of fire Prentice established with his system of hilltop fortifications. Cannoneers of the 33rd Missouri blistered Parson from Battery C, while artillery on Battery B and the sharpshooters of the 28th Wisconsin raked Dandridge McRae's Arkansans. Governor Henry Rector's son was among the Arkansas troops killed in this battle, and the guns on Battery D, which no longer were being hindered by Fagin's assault because it had faltered, were able to return an earlier favor and turn their guns on Parsons Missourians. Wisconsinite J.D. Cummings wrote of this assault: "We had the prettiest chance you could imagine. We just picked them off like sheep and they marched up the hill. We lay behind stumps and logs and could see them fall 8 or 9 at a time." A soldier of McRae's 30th Arkansas noted that as they moved forward, "We were so near the guns that they had no range on us, and our regiment huddled on a little point of the ridge like so many sheep. The enemy infantry on our right could see our condition and poured all the Minnie balls toward us they could." But Price's men did perform magnificently. Despite the searing Yankee fire, the rebel troops did 3 separate assaults, and on the 3rd one, they overran the Union defenses of Battery C, driving the 33rd Missouri troops back into town in what would be the Confederate high tide at Helena. So the artillerymen who had come along rushed forward to turn the cannon against the Yanks, and they discovered that one gun had been spiked, and the others were devoid of friction primers and priming wires. so they were unable to use those cannon. The Union forces, however, had no shortage of cannon or ammunition, and General Salomon marshaled his defenses for a devastating counterattack. So all of the guns, all of the Union guns, Fort Curtis batteries, Battery D, A, and B, all turned their guns on Battery C, as well as the explosive 8-inch shells from the gunboat Tyler, which will fire 413 rounds during the course of this battle. General Salomon dismounted the 1st Indiana Cavalry, which was no longer needed since Walker was not pressing his assault up near Battery A, and they were brought in to help block the Confederates to within the confines of Battery C. Charles O. Musser of Iowa observed the effect of the artillery counterattacks on Price's division. He wrote, "The rest of our batteries got range of them, and the gunboats also began to shell them. Oh, what slaughter and bloodshed! They were mowed down by hundreds by the grape shot and shell. It makes the cold chills run over me as I think of the dreadful scene I witnessed on the battlefield. Men lying in heaps in some of the ravines, 4 and 5 deep." Newton Scott, an officer with the 2nd Arkansas Infantry of African descent on the Union left, observed as, quote, "They carried the rifle pits and come ahead on the battery and took the battery. The rebels was now in fair view, and our artillery just mowed them, and our infantry had a crossfire on them, and they could not stand it." So at this moment, the brain trust of Sterling Price and Theophilus Holmes shows up at Battery C and begin offering contradictory orders. Holmes ordered part of Parsons' brigade to charge Fort Curtis. These men will charge down the hill and swiftly become trapped by Union gunfire. At the same time, McRae is ordered to take his men. At this point, he has 200 left of the 1,200 he had started the day with, to join the assault on Battery D. This attack was futile, and McRae and his men are also quickly punched down. This final sacrifice did offer Fagan one last chance to achieve his objective. So as the attention of the Union artillery on Battery D was diverted by the targets afforded by McRae's troops, Fagan's Arkansans moved forward one last time and finally took the penultimate line of trenches below the Yankee battery, but they're too weary to dislodge them. Fagan wrote, the fort yet remains to be taken. Of all the many obstacles and threatening fortifications opposite our advance that morn, there only remained the fort. Rugged and almost impassable ravines, the steepest and most broken hillsides, abattis, and line after line of breastworks had been passed and left behind. Before us there only remained the fort, and there they would remain. So finally, at 10:30 a.m., Holmes will look over his grand attack. Marmaduke and Walker are completely stalled. Price's division's been decimated on Battery C, and Fagan is fatally mired at the very gates of Battery D. The Confederate commander will order a general withdraw, his strategy in shambles, and his army in tatters. One Texan who was with him wrote that it was in this fallback, though still under fire, that General Holmes exposed himself recklessly and sought death, but it would not come. And half crazy because of his defeat, he commenced his retreat to Little Rock with his whole army. John Newman Edwards of Joe Shelby's staff wrote later that Holmes, quote, remarked gloomily afterward that to him death upon the field was preferable to disaster, that he had prayed for it earnestly when the attack proved a failure. But no bullet will end Holmes's life on this day. A lot of the troops around Battery C simply dropped their weapons rather than face the ghastly gauntlet of the Tyler's deadly shells. and others beat a hasty retreat. Confederate William Bull reported that there was a rush made by the entire force we had left in front of the fort. We were thrown down and then learned that General Price had sent in orders for the men to get out as quickly as possible to avoid capture. Pendle's sharpshooters continued firing, quote, holding the enemy in check, covering the retreat, which was rather precipitate, James Wallace wrote. He wrote, the Yankees, emboldened by our retreat, followed us a short distance, and firing with their artillery made it rather warm of comfort for us until we were out of range of their guns, which was done as soon as our weary legs could do it, urged on by the dread of being shot in the back, which we felt as broad as a barn door. Marmaduke, who was disgusted with Walker's overly cautious behavior, didn't even bother telling him about the retreat, and Walker is almost cut off by a strike force from Colonel Rice's Iowans at Battery A. They do get away, however. So that left the battlefield in possession of the Union troops. Captain Thomas Stevens of the 28th Wisconsin described the aftermath in a letter to his wife. He wrote, I went over the field about Battery C and D in the afternoon. It was a sickening sight. The ridges and ravines were thickly strewn with ghastly corpses covered with gore, heads, arms, and legs shot away, mutilated in almost every manner by shot and shell, while the groans of the severely wounded could be heard on every side. It was a bloody fight. On one spot of ground less than a rod square lay 9 dead bodies. Under every bush, alongside every log and stump, were the wounded. The slightly wounded mostly escaped from the field, but a great many were afterwards captured, and others came in and gave themselves up. John Savage of Wisconsin wrote that there they lay in all shapes, postures, and positions under this blazing sun with the flies crawling in and out of their wounds. What a work for the anniversary of American independence. American against American. Around Graveyard Hill, William Kreitz of the 5th Kansas wrote that found their dead were mangled by our shells in every conceivable shape, and some could only be recognized as belonging to humanity by their clothing. There lay in a confused mass 12 as they had been stricken down by the explosion of a shell, most of them dead, others expiring. Here a mutilated trunk, less a head, here a body rent asunder with hands extended, clutching apparently at vacancy, and eyes protruding with that particularly stony stare, death's most repulsive signet. In reporting the battle to his superiors, Holmes wrote, I write this report with deep pain. I commanded brave, gallant, and willing troops and should have succeeded in the capture of Helena, for though the difficulties were very great, they were not insurmountable, and the misfortune of failure was in very great consequence on the men not being well in hand after success. So Granny Holmes ended up blaming the loss on his men. Well, for the Confederates, the attack on Helena was an unmitigated disaster. They lost 1,636 dead, wounded, and missing out of the 7,646 troops engaged. Union casualties were much lighter, 239 killed, wounded, and missing out of the 4,129 engaged. So why did the Battle of Helena end as it did? Well, on the front end, the Union did several things right. They, by fortifying the town with interlocking fields of fire and having the troops in place by 2:30 a.m., Prentiss and his men were well ready for the attack. David Moore of Fagan's division wrote, we were badly whipped, not from any want of bravery on the part of men or officers, but the natural positions, together with the fortifications around the place, could have defied almost twice our number. Frederick Salomon used the interior lines to move his support troops where they were needed to back up any places that were under assault. So it was a masterful job on his part. And naval superiority sealed the deal. The big guns of the Tyler supplied overwhelming firepower to beat back the only Confederate success today, the capture of Battery C. If there's any fault that can be found or criticism, it might be that Prentiss failed to pursue the beaten army. Holmes's army will be bleeding deserters as it retreats toward Little Rock. Many of them being Arkansan from the Arkansas infantry who had suffered such heavy casualties at Battery batteries D and C. And the Confederate infantry would play very little part in the subsequent Union conquest of Little Rock. Holmes's chief of engineer accurately wrote that Little Rock was lost at the Battle of Helena. The same token, the South did several things wrong. The three-pronged attack would have been difficult under the best of circumstances. The roads were blocked, eliminating artillery, which would have been the best hope for subduing the hilltop forts. Marsh Walker's failure to support Marmaduke doomed the attack on Battery A and led to bad blood between the two generals that would result a couple of months later in a duel between the two in which Marmaduke will mortally wound Marsh Walker. And the ultimate blame belongs, I maintain, to Sterling Price. His inexcusable failure to launch the attack on Battery C in a timely manner when he could hear the roar of battle on either side totally doomed any chance of Confederate success on that day. It allowed the Union to beat off the attacks in detail. So I always leave the final word on the Battle of Helena to George Kilmer. He's a former Confederate soldier who sacrificed both hands to an explosion on Graveyard Hill. He wrote after the war, "Since that day at Helena, I tell the boys I'd rather buck against a voodoo than to try down Old Glory on the 4th of July. Yes, the Union is good enough for me on the 4th of July and every other day in the year, and I don't regret the price I paid for finding out." So if you have any questions, feel free to shoot me an email at mchrist@cals.org. And thank you.